We're going to begin today with the recognition that I made a mistake the first couple of years that I was your pastor, and that was that everything happened so quickly around Easter. I mean, there are a dozen sermons that just take place in that 1 week. So I have since, in the last several years, tried to get a little jump on this whole Easter scenario, and that's one of the things that we're going to try to do today. There were a number of contributors to this particular sermon. A pastor by the name of Kevin Miller, there Charles Ryrie, of course, the Tyndall Boat Study Bible, the Nelson Study Bible, J. Vernon McGee, David Jeremiah, and others. And they all went into the development of this sermon. I'm going to read for the Gospel of John. The Gospel of John. Excuse me, no, I've got 2 pages here, forgive me. The Gospel of Matthew, chapter 27, verses 22 through 25. Pilate said to them, "What then shall I do with Jesus, who is called Christ?" They all said, "Let him be crucified." Then the governor said, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they cried out all more, saying, "Let him be crucified." When Pilate saw that he could not prevail at all, but rather that the tumult was rising, he took water and washed his hands before the multitude, saying, "I am innocent of the blood of this just person. You see it." And all the people answered and said, "His blood be on us and on our children." Then he released Barabbas to them, and then he was scourged. And then he was delivered to be crucified. May God add a blessing to the reading of his word. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be acceptable in your sight. O Lord, you are my strength and you are my redeemer. A word about the method that we're going to try to invoke in delivering this sermon. This will be a little bit different than anything we've done before. Much of it will be said in the first person. Rather than have this historical context, I'm going to try to place you there with Pilate and with Jesus Christ. And in so doing, I will do things like I'll say, "And Pilate rested his arms on the marble sides of his chair." That is not in Scripture. So you need to be very, very careful about adding things that are not in Scripture. That's the first point. That's very important. But there is some liberty to stretch out just a little bit when I say that somebody sighed at the learning of a particular event. So I've been very, very careful not to do anything that is counter-scriptural here. This is really a scenario where Holy Week, and in fact our whole lives, your life and my life, can be kind of brought together in the washing of one's hands and the washing of one's feet. Actually, it's even simpler than that. Whole lives can be demonstrated with just 2 basins that are referred to in this sermon. Will we choose the basin of service or the basin of power? One must choose very carefully, because you can only choose one, and you can only choose once. As I say, this story of Holy Week can be told with 2 basins, and maybe the entire story and your whole life can be wrapped up in these 2 basins. So I want you to listen closely and see how you fit into one of these 2 pictures. It was still dark, sunrise barely visible in the eastern sky, as Pilate walked across the pavement to the double-arched gateway, accompanied as always by 2 soldiers. The red imperial plumes on their helmets bobbing a little as they walked. The Jews privately made fun of those feathers. They looked kind of foolish to them, but they wouldn't dare let that mockery go public. Pilate resents being summoned at a meeting like this at this hour. He's angry about it. The high priest said it was an emergency, but to the Jews, he muttered to himself, everything's an emergency to the Jews. If there's one thing that Pilate had learned in his 3 years as governor of this backwater province, was that the Jews were fierce about their religion. They cannot be reasoned with, Pilate says. They're hard-nosed religious zealots who on occasion had to be reasoned with by force. Pilate is hoping that this will not be another occasion of an uprising. He resents that he has to be there even at all. He could be at his palace on the Mediterranean, watching over those shimmering blue waters. But at Passover, that's a dangerous time. You can almost plan on some crazy zealot starting some riot. So he reasons that it is probably better for him to be there. Almost to reassure himself, he looks at these 4 giant columns that are over 100 feet high, and they're surrounding him. He is in his fortress. He's got 600 soldiers nearby at all times. Surely no Jew would try to force some type of insurrection with that kind of men around. Pilate even keeps under lock and key the ceremonial robes that the Jewish high priests wear. He didn't want some would-be Messiah to don that deep blue robe with its fringes of gold and bells and declare a religious state. Couldn't have that. He had to be careful this time of year. The great Jewish celebration was upon them, and it was full of tension and high energy. Still, at Passover, the robe was released to the high priest to use. If trouble was going to start, it would probably be right about now. The crowd was filling the gateway as Pilate got there. He saw the high priests, the members of the great Sanhedrin, the scribes, some temple police. They were all packed together, but none would take even a step inside that fortress. So they wouldn't be defiled, so they say. Well, Pilate resented that also. Why did the Jews have to look down on everybody else? Why couldn't they just come inside like normal people? Good morning, honorable sir, the high priest begins. I'm sorry to bother you so early, but this couldn't wait. This man, as he motioned behind him until a man who had his hands tied behind his back was thrust forward so that Pilate could see him. This man claims to be a king. He stirs up trouble everywhere he goes. He and the people who follow him are committing all kinds of crimes against the church. Pilate looked him over. The prisoner was about 30 years old, about the same age as Pilate. But they looked nothing alike. Whoever this was had bruises on his face, and his cheekbones were nearly showing. Swelling around his eyes. He was a rough country robe that was torn in places that was around him. The abuse that he had experienced at the hands of his captors had left him a filthy mess. He didn't appear to be a king of any kind at all. Now, Pilate didn't mean to boast, but he did know how to dress. A fine linen tunic with embroidered patterns on the sleeves, a toga draped around his shoulders with reddish-purple bands along the edges. He looked in the prisoner's eyes, and he asks, "Do you claim to be the King of the Jews?" The prisoner spoke very quietly. "So you say." What does that mean? It certainly wasn't a show of defiance. Pilate looked at the priest as if to say, "You got me up for this? This is what is so important? This is what can't wait?" They started accusing the prisoner of crimes. He broke their Sabbath. He claimed he would tear down the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. Pilate asks the prisoner, "Aren't you going to defend yourself? How do you answer these charges?" But the prisoner looked down, silent. He's unusual, I'll say that, Pilate thought. But I know criminals, and I'm telling you that this is not one. Pilate's political mind kicked in and now saw clearly what was going on. This poor rabbi had gotten too popular. He'd been dragged here by the high priest for a crime of provoking their envy. This guy has become more popular than those in the Jewish religious deep state, and they couldn't tolerate that threat to their base of power. Pilate was convinced that he now understood the raging crowd's motivation. But still, he had to control this situation before it got out of hand. He looked at the crowd and was blunt. "I find nothing wrong with this man." They raised their hands in protest. "But he's causing riots wherever he goes, all over Judea, from Galilee to Jerusalem." "Oh, he's from Galilee," Pilate asked. "Then take him to Herod. That's his jurisdiction." He turned and walked away feeling satisfied. He needed a way to scuttle this situation, and they had just handed one to him. But only 90 minutes later, they were back. Herod's message was simple. "Thanks for the fun." The prisoner was now wrapped in a purple cloak, and of course it didn't fit, and it hung from the narrow frame of Jesus Christ. Pilate could just imagine the rest. Guards from Herod's garrison mocked the king of the Jews and had made their point. But Herod had come to the same conclusion that Pilate had, that the prisoner was actually harmless. Herod found him not guilty, Pilate told the priests. "I had already found him not guilty myself. You take him and try him in your own religious courts." But the crowd hollered back, "Only a Roman can inflict the death penalty, and by our law he has to die because he claims to be God." A god? That unnerved Pilate. He needed to probe this further. So he motioned, and the prisoner was brought under guard into the giant courtyard. It's a public area with polished stone. "Where are you from?" Pilate asked the prisoner. No answer. "Don't you want to talk?" Pilate demanded. "Don't you know that I have the power to release you or to crucify you?" Finally, the prisoner spoke. "You would have no power over me unless it was given to you from above. So the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." Now, let me step out of the sermon for just a moment. John's gospel is the only one that records Jesus saying those words. And I think we all fully understand, "You would have no power over me unless it were given to you from above." We all understand that he received that power from God Almighty. But the second part of the phrase is a bit more questionable. "So the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." Who is that? Who is Jesus referring to? Was it the religious leaders? Was it Caiaphas? Was it Judas? Was it the devil, who is the author of all things terrible? Was it God the Father? Or was it you and me? That's the beauty of the Bible. I suggest to you, friends, it was all of those things. It was all of those things. But what a question for Jesus to pose to Pilate. Some have even said that it must be the Jewish leaders because they had a premeditated method of killing Jesus Christ, where Pilate was just in a position to say yea or nay. That makes logical sense. But so does the sin of the world, hammering him to that wooden cross. Pilate was getting disoriented. What's happening here? This is his judicial seat. This is his fortress, so to speak. He had all the power, but somehow it didn't feel like he had all that power. He knew what he could do. And he announced to the high priest, "I will have him flogged." Then he climbed the steps to a seat of honor and sat down. Marble lions flanked him on either side. Here Pilate was surrounded by soldiers and officials and servants, but even the sitting, his head would be the highest in the crowd. He was tired of getting pushed around this morning. So the soldiers took Jesus to the garrison. Pilate knew what would happen. He knew how those lead-tipped whips would snap in the air before they bit into the skin. He knew how the flesh of the prisoner would be literally ripped wide open as those stinging strands of the whip wrapped around the body before being yanked back for another horrible lashing, then another, then another, then another. While he waited for the flogging to end, he got a note from his wife. "I had a terrible dream last night," she writes, "about an innocent man. Be careful what you do with this one." Surely this dream was a coincidence, Pilate may have thought, or maybe it was not. The prisoner was finally marched back. Now he had to be held up on both sides. He had a purple robe on his back, but Pilate's troops had added the finishing touch, a crown of branches made of thorns that was rammed down onto his skull. It's probably about 8:30 by then. The Mediterranean sun had begun to rise and things were getting hot. Pilate wiped his brow, being careful not to move that laurel wreath which showed who was really in charge here. Then he issued his judgment. "Here's your man. I have investigated him thoroughly, and he has done nothing deserving of death. Therefore, I had him flogged." "No, that's not what we want. They say, 'Crucify him, crucify him.' Why? What crime has he done?" The voices were rising. "I told you, I've decided to release him." And then the fulcrum point comes. "But if you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar's. Anyone who declares himself a king is a rebel against Caesar." Pilate's face went white. "I don't want this coming back on me," he thought. "I've been reprimanded by Rome once before, and I'm not going to let that happen again." He gripped each of his marble armrests. This is not turning out as he had thought it should. He looked at the prisoner, his hands hanging limp at his sides, but there was something in his face that Pilate couldn't read. What was it? Was it certainty? Was it a calm nature? Was it an understanding of what was to come? He couldn't make it out. It was almost like all this was turning out exactly as the prisoner had known. Pilate finally mentioned to his servant, "Get me a basin of water." Jesus was dazed by this beating, but perhaps when he heard that word basin, it made him think of the night before. He'd had nothing to eat since dinner, nothing to drink. He thought back to the bread, the wine, the sweetness of the Passover. They'd met upstairs in a barred room. Since no one was hosting, there was no one to greet them, no servant to wash their feet. Jesus had seen the looks of his friends' faces as they darted back to one another, wondering, "Who's going to wash our feet? I don't think it's going to be me." So Jesus had gotten up from the table and laid his robe aside. He wrapped a towel around his waist, and he found a simple pottery basin and poured in water. He got down on his hands and knees and worked his way around that table, washing each one's feet and drying them with the towel at his waist. As he lowered his head, sometimes his hair brushed the feet and even the floor around these disciples. But inside he felt a peace, a calmness. He knew that the Father had given him authority over everything. There was nothing to prove, nothing to push for, just the freedom to serve. He held a little longer the feet of the one who would no longer look him in the face, the one who would sell him out, the one who would get rich as an informant. "Treason," Pilate said, and Jesus snapped back to where he was. The verdict is treason against the Emperor of Rome, and the penalty is to be crucified until dead. Sandals snapped the stone pavement, and the servant came back carrying a basin full of water. It wasn't cheap clay like the one Jesus had carried. This was a polished basin made of brass. The servant got down on his knees, though, and just as Jesus had, and he lifted this basin above his head so that it was in easy reach of the governor. Pilate sunk his hands into the water and held them there for a moment. He was going to make sure that nobody missed this action. All of this would be carefully choreographed. He finally dried his hands, and Pilate spat out the words, "I am innocent of this man's blood. This is your responsibility." And the people shouted back, "Let his blood be on us and on our children." Pilate looked down in that pool of water, and it seemed to be much like a mirror, reflecting back to him who he really was. Friend, the entire Holy Week can be told in the tale of these two basins. The entire story of your life and my life can be told in those two basins. Will we choose the basin of service or the basin of power? Will we take responsibility or abdicate it? Will we get dirty or ignore the need? There are two basins. We can only choose one, and we can only choose it once.